So I recently had what I thought was an oil pressure problem in this vehicle. It's a 2006 Chevy Silverado. I was driving home on a Sunday night on the highway, and had been driving for about an hour and a half, and I suddenly noticed that the oil pressure gauge was fluctuating pretty drastically. It would go from 40 down to almost zero, and then back up to 40, and then down a little bit. So I wasn't sure what was happening. Let's go into the vehicle and take a look at the gauge for a second. So here's the oil gauge. When you start the car, the oil pressure sensor senses the rising pressure in the bottom of the engine block that's generated by the oil pump, and this gauge goes from 0 up to a steady state of 40. That's what it's supposed to look like all the time. You increase the RPMs, it'll move up a little. As the motor warms up, the oil gets thinner, it'll drop a little, but it generally should be very steady. When I was driving home the other night, the gauge on the highway suddenly went down, went almost to zero, came back up, went down again, came back up, like this. So it was wavering. So I stopped the car. I went and I checked for an oil leak underneath. I checked the dipstick to make sure that oil wasn't getting low. I checked to see if the engine was getting hotter by watching this gauge, and it wasn't. And I listened to the sound of the engine, and I heard no different sound. It sounded the way it normally runs. So my conclusion was that I didn't have an oil pressure problem. I had either a gauge problem or oil pressure sensor problem. I didn't have an oil pressure problem, so I kept driving the car. I had about another 15 minutes. I drove home. The next day, I pulled out the oil pressure sensor, and this is what they look like. In the bottom, you can see there is a little hole. That little hole lets the oil pressure or the oil go into a chamber inside of this, which senses the oil pressure and then sends that information to the computer, which then controls the gauge. What's going on inside of this is this. This is a picture of the gauge. These are the wires coming into it. There's the hole in the bottom of it, and this is the chamber that the oil can go into through the hole. And that's a flexible diaphragm. Oil pressure comes in through the hole. So as the oil pressure increases, this diaphragm gets pushed up. On top of it, there's a little electrode, and the wire from the computer comes in to this electrode, and it goes over here, and this is a resistor, and this thing slides up and down the resistor. So as the oil pressure increases, the resistance across this surface, since this thing slides up, is reduced. And as the oil pressure drops and this slides down, there's more resistance because this is a longer section as that slides down, and the resistance increases. So the computer can detect that and determine what the oil pressure is, and then adjust the gauge so that we can see it. Anyway, I was going to install this new one because I figured that the gauge was no good, but just for the heck of it, I decided to try to clean up the old one. I guessed that after 140,000 miles and 14 years that there might have developed some sludge in the oil that got in there and was sort of clogging up that chamber inside. So I just thought it was worth a shot to use some cleaner. I use gum out, but you can use this CRC contact cleaner as well. Anything that will dissolve oil sludge, oil deposits, that kind of varnish, anything that comes from petroleum products. So I just put this in there, gave it a good spray, let the, shook it out. I saw some looked like some little pieces of crud came out, but I did that, and I put it back in, and that was probably a month ago. I've probably driven at least 1,000 miles since then, and the gauge has been working perfectly. So I didn't have an oil pressure problem, and I didn't even have to install this new gauge. It's not that they're expensive. I think they're like good ones, probably 30-35 bucks. But if it's just easy enough to just clean something out, leave it in there, why not? So the oil pressure sensor gauge on this motor is down behind the intake manifold, right down there. I used a 12-inch extension on a 1/2-inch ratchet, on a 3/8-inch ratchet, and it came off very easily. So I thought this would be helpful to people who are having a gauge that's fluctuating and they're not sure if it's the oil gauge, but if they think they have to replace the oil gauge, then maybe they don't have to. Thanks very much, and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos like this.